All right, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name is Tiffany Chan. I am the co-chair for the UCSF Asian Pacific American Systemwide Alliance, also known as APASA. Thank you so much all for joining us today. APASA is a diversity committee and a campus resource group for staff, faculty, and health employees at UCSF. And APASA began in 2007 to promote professional and social relations within UCSF, as well as the rich and diverse cultural heritage for all Asian communities. The APASA Steering Committee, composed of employee volunteers across UCSF, leads and supports the work, and a special appreciation to Suzanne Sutton and Michelle Tang, my co-chair, for leading the panel event and organizing today's event. Thank you. The Asian American Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander AANHPI Leadership Panel is held in conjunction to celebrate October's Diversities Month as well as Filipino American History Month. Filipino American History Month is celebrated annually in October, commemorating the arrival of the first Filipinos in modern-day Morro Bay, California on October 18, 1587. At UCSF, Filipinx, Filipinas, Filipinos are underrepresented minorities at UCSF, so we make up the second largest Asian American ethnic group employed at UCSF. The UCSF United Filipinx Association, or UFAs, their mission is to represent the Filipinx voice and shaping the culture of belonging, equity, diversity at our institution through open sharing of resources, social gatherings, and various workshops to foster personal and professional development. So UFA is one of our sponsors of this event today. In addition, we would also like to thank the Office of Diversity and Outreach, the Department of Anesthesia and Perioperative Care, AAPI Coalition for their sponsorship. The leadership panel today is a platform for our UCSF AANHPI leaders to share their personal and professional experiences, highlight their career trajectories, offer guidance for others navigating similar challenges, and discuss current issues affecting the AANHPI community. By fostering open community discussions, this panel aims to inspire future AANHPI leaders, strengthen the community, and promote diversity, equity, and inclusion at UCSF. And I'm very delighted to present the leaders for our panel today. Starting with right on my right side is Maria Jaochico, the Director of Office of Restorative Justice and Practices. Ramu Nagappan, the Director of Leadership Institute for the School of Nursing, as well as UCSF Health. And then we have Joanna Trammell. She's the Chief Operating Officer and Executive Director for Campus Life Services. And then we have Peter Ching Hong, who is the Associate Dean for Regional Campuses for the School of Medicine. And then last but not least, we have very happy to have Juanha back, who's the Vice Chancellor of Office of Communications. He was the alumni of the first panel event we ever had and returning today as our moderator. So their biographies, you can find it in the QR code here or in the handout that you might have received when you walked in. And you can also find other information about the history of this panel and APASA and how you can connect with us there. So, after this panel, we will have time for you to ask some questions, and then followed by a reception. We're hoping to have the back, but maybe we need to do it outside with a little bit of food. So hope you can come and celebrate with us. We're serving Filipino food. We want to celebrate Filipino American History Month, and we hope that we have an opportunity to get to know you as well. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it to our moderator, Juanha, to kick it off.
Thank you very much, Tiffany, and welcome everyone. Thank you. As panel discussions go, right, sometimes you get easy questions and sometimes you get hard questions. I want to thank my panelists to my left because they all agreed to only hard questions. In truth, we did have a planning session, and I gave them a sense of how I like to moderate panels, and that's don't have it too rehearsed. Ask some tough questions, open-ended questions that allow each person to sort of weigh in on quite frankly, questions that don't have easy answers or black and white answers. So that's the goal today, is to be a little bit thought-provoking, maybe a little bit provocative, and maybe touch on topics that are sometimes difficult to discuss in the context of what we're talking about today. So the first question is going to be fairly straightforward and easy. It's going to be a question I'm going to ask each of the panelists to actually answer, and maybe also provide a little bit of your sort of background in terms of maybe where you grew up or how you identify yourself. So the first question is this, and I think this is pretty predictable. The term Asian American is overly broad. We can all agree to that. You don't even need to be Asian American to understand that. There are some 20 plus different nationalities, cultures, languages, etc. How do you take such a heterogeneous group and flatten it into a single category called Asian American? This can be said for our Latinx communities as well, even our Black American communities there too. So for Asian Americans then, how do you reconcile that? Are there moments when you feel your specific background is erased or misunderstood within the broader category of Asian American labels? And what are the implications of this overly broad category when it comes to representation, advocacy, and policymaking? Why don't we start with Maria?
I locked eyes, that's why, right? We locked eyes.
That's why I don't look at Juan at all.
You turned my way. I see you, Peter.
I'm hiding.
Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Welcome, welcome. Kamusta po, mga kapamilya? Welcome, family. Welcome. I'm Maria Jaochico, she, her pronouns. And by way of introductions, I want to share a little bit about my background. So when I tell my story and who I am and my leadership experience, you're informed by my background and my upbringing. So I was born in the Philippines, in Quezon City. My ancestors, and for my Filipinos, they're trying to figure out if we're related, so here we go. I'm proud Ilocana, ancestors from Cabugao, Cagayan, and Sanchez Mira, and in Pawai. And my upbringing, I was raised by my grandparents, and my parents moved to the US, as the story goes, to build a better life for their family. So when I was 8 and 9 years old, they brought us over, and we settled in Savannah, Georgia. So my upbringing of being Asian and Asian American is informed by living in the South, in the deep South. So that's who I am, and the question. Try not to answer like I'm Miss Universe, Miss Philippines.
How are you going to solve world peace?
I know. I mean, that is all the questions, right? How do you, oh my goodness. Okay, so my contribution to the question is, I think that's why it's really important to do oh my God, my notes says disaggregating data. Yes, my tongue needed to practice that a little bit. Disaggregating data is important. To understand the nuance of experiences, to understand the needs of each of what the multiple ethnicities that make up Asian Americans. Because as you know, like you mentioned, we're not monolithic, we're not homogenous, it's not one experience. And lastly, what I'll say is I think what impacts that is what our ancestors' relationship and our home country's relationship to the US and colonization and our experiences of now, I think informs for sure how we experience the US, and so that's going to impact how we are in the workplace as well. And I know we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but disaggregating data is one way we can just parse all of the different nuances of our experiences.
Thank you. Ramu?
Thanks. I'm also delighted to be here. I just returned to UCSF 3 weeks ago, so I'm new-ish. Although I was here before. I was telling Maria before we got started, I was here at UCSF in the early 2000s, so 20 years ago. I was sitting in the back there watching some faculty in School of Medicine deliver their lecture, so it's fun to be back. And I've had a long career journey, an amazing career journey, which I'm happy to share as we go along here. But to take you back to my origins, I was born in India, in South India, in a little town called, well, not so little, town called Madurai. It's the Tamil-speaking region of the country. Immigrated here with my parents when I was less than a year old in the midst of a snowstorm, and my father came here to be an intern in internal medicine in Buffalo, New York. So that was my landing place. And quite a journey from there throughout the East Coast, Midwest, and then ending up here about 30 years ago in the Bay Area. So to get to the heart of the question, yeah, I think it's complicated. And I'll start by saying, this gets at this issue of intersectionality, and there's a frustrating tension there when we think about the complexity of our identities and the contradictions therein. There's never an easy answer because as I think about my friends and colleagues who are South Asian or Indian American, many of them frankly sort of disavow the category of Asian American. They think that Asian American is for East Asians or Southeast Asians. So again, tension there, right? I personally kind of think about it as a sort of a both and, that all the categories apply, that there is something incredibly valuable and productive about the allyship that comes from the broader category of kind of the Asian American community. That we think, when we think about representation, both political and cultural, that larger community makes sense. It's vital as we think about this. But at the same time, there are these layers beneath that we don't want to lose sight of, and so that's what I often reflect on too. My disciplinary background, I did a PhD in English, actually, at Berkeley a long time ago, in the 90s. So I'm particularly interested in stories. And so for me, all the stories underneath that tell the story of our origins, of our families, of our foodways, of all the kind of complex network of relationships we have, all those things are important too as we think about this category, which is a contested category, of course. So I'm in favor of the tension. I think it's, like I said, a productive one. But it forces me to be more self-reflective and to acknowledge, my own depths, but also recognizing that when I'm interacting with others, I need to be mindful of and avoid assumptions about someone just because they fit into one particular category, because there's a whole host of others that I'm not going to know about until I've had that dialogue and understand that person's stories.
Thank you, Ramu.
Hi, good afternoon. I'm Joanna Trammell, and I'm the COO for Campus Life Services, and I've been in this role for a whole 3 months, so I'm a total expert now. But thank you so much for coming. And so a little bit about myself. I was born in San Francisco and grew up in Oakland. My mom is Korean, and my dad's African American. And so, when we talk about being misunderstood, I think that's been something that's been pretty much my whole life, where Koreans didn't know what to make of me, and going to functions and all this, and I'd start speaking Korean, and they're like, "Whoa! Like, how did you learn that?" Or being with African Americans who were like, "Well, you're black? Like, I didn't know," and so. That's something that I'm really sensitive to, where when we talk about creating this broad category, there's also this category of mixed Asian Americans, and where do they fit into that picture, into that mold, which I think a lot of times, and even now, still is a bit understood and overlooked. And so I think there needs to be more discussions on that and the sensitivity around mixed Asian Americans and how they want to be feeling a sense of belonging and inclusion in the multiple communities and cultures that they are a part of, and being able to embrace that and not having to be pegged into one mold, but to being able to embrace everything about your identity.
Hello, everybody. The problem with going last is that everybody already said all the wonderful things. So I was going on the list. Okay, disaggregation data, check. Intersectionality, check. Multiple races and experiences, check. So what do I have to say? I guess I could agree with above and below, but I'll start by telling you a little bit about myself. I'm Peter Chinhong. I was born and raised in the Caribbean, in Trinidad, the most southern Caribbean island, home of the steel band Calypso and Limbo. And my grandfather jumped in a boat in southern China, and I guess his particular boat went to the Caribbean, other boats went to other parts. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if his boat went somewhere else, but I'm pretty happy where I ended up. Grew up in a very remote village, and when my dad was 3, he was sent back to China. And I think back in those days, people, if you were Indian, if you were Chinese, sometimes your kids would be sent back to the motherland because there was no internet, and that's the way you would carry on the traditions in an outpost so far away from the whole. There was a Nobel laureate, Derek Walcott from Trinidad, who said that the Caribbean is made up of people, like that Japanese art form where you break the vase and then you put it back together with glue. When you put it back together, it's not beautiful and symmetrical like the original, but you put it back together with so much love. You put back those pieces together. And I think that's what the Caribbean experience is like. You bring all these different cultures, and at the same time, you don't know exactly who you are. You kind of have a vague sense of it, and it gets upended from place to place, but you love it so much, and you want to hold on to those traditions. I'm mainly Chinese, but then through my grandmother, etc., I also have a little bit of Indian and a little bit of Scottish in me, based on the people in Trinidad. So that when I went to college in New England, it was very hard for me to figure out who I was. All the California Asian kids were playing volleyball and drinking boba, and I was, we didn't have boba in Trinidad, and I wasn't tall enough for volleyball. So, but I shared some of the same cultural traditions, so that was what connected me to them. But I also identified a lot with people from the Caribbean too, primarily Afro-Caribbean people, because that's where I grew up, and that we had a village store and we tended to all these people all the time. So those are also my people, but I didn't visually look like that, so it was just a hard contradiction to make. And during college, and this would be the last story before Juan gets on to his next question. His questions get harder and harder, by the way.
Keep it going then. Keep talking, Peter.
I went to the Pacific Islands as part of a research study, and it was such a contrast to me. And I spent over 5 years, I spent a little time every year, and in Samoa to be precise. And it was such a contrast because I remember saying, wow, these people they know exactly where their lineage comes from, and it's very, very direct, and they have a strong sense of who they are, and it was so different from the Caribbean. So in some ways, it was a really, really nice contrast, and it gave me a balance in which I faced the world.
Thank you to all of the panelists. I mean, in a sample size of 4, you can see just how diverse the backgrounds can be, obviously. And we did that for a point, to illustrate the point, obviously. Now we're going to switch gears a little bit. The questions are going to get harder, as I promised. So buckle in, Peter. Because the next question is going to come to you first. While being cognizant that we need to be very careful in perpetuating stereotypes, I know I've heard from other Asian Americans who feel caught between the principles of meritocracy that their families reinforced, and this is especially true in 0- and first-generation immigrant families, and the principles of equity that guide the dominant narrative of advocacy for the underrepresented. Peter, how do you reconcile these different values? Do you think it's possible for meritocracy to exist without perpetuating racial inequities, or do we need to reframe the entire conversation?
That's a great question, and very, very tough for me personally, because, my tradition is mainly Asian American, but because of my upbringing and because of many of us in this room, we're all for the principles of equity, and I feel that strongly. So I think you can have both, and the way I'll put it together is something called contextual meritocracy, meaning that you have to reduce barriers for people to then be able to excel. And if you don't reduce those or dismantle those barriers, you can't really have, it's good for everybody. I remember thinking about this a lot because, of my work with the School of Medicine and some work with admissions and so on. And the way we do it at UCSF is something called, called holistic admissions, where we don't just look at grades, which is the whole idea of meritocracy, is like the best if you are best academically, you can get the opportunities, but it's more than just that for, to get ideas and to do science and to, promote healthcare in the future. It's about having other perspectives. So holistic admissions is one way in which you bring other people's lived experience together. But, so I was thinking about that, and there is this Yale law professor called, I think, Daniel Markowitz, who wrote this book called, he was just basically challenging the notions of meritocracy. And of course, meritocracy is something that's ingrained in me being an immigrant, and Asian American life. You work hard, you get good grades, and you should move forward. But this person from Yale was saying that it's probably not as great for all of us as it seems, because what you're doing is you're providing more and more stress as more and more people rely on the idea that their grades and their hard work will get them to a certain place, because there isn't enough slots for everybody. If you just rely on that, and it just keeps on perpetuating within. You get opportunities because your family has a certain amount of wealth, and then it's not that the other people wouldn't get the chance to shine if they didn't have the same opportunities as those. So I think it's tough being Asian American and also feeling very strongly about equity. So it is a contradiction, but I think the first thing I do is reflect on my own biases and my own upbringing, and just think about the idea that, I don't think of people's hard work and achievements as being a bad thing, but I think that you need to dismantle barriers to get people to shine, is the way I think about it. And so then I can have my cake and eat it too.
I like that response. I'm going to ask Maria to help build on that theme just a little bit with a slightly different question. Everyone has heard about the lawsuits that were filed against Harvard for discrimination against Asian American applicants. So in that context, Maria, those tensions that were revealed in that situation, how do we personally navigate that tension between supporting notions of affirmative action, even though that's not a phrase we use here in California, as a tool for racial justice, and recognizing concerns around discrimination against Asian Americans? How do you balance that? How do you navigate that?
That was not the question I said I can answer.
I think he changed the order to make things.
Did you see that? So I think I have to think a little bit more about it, because and it all boils down to my experience of living in the South, and that's my upbringing of being in a predominantly white institution and my experience there. So I think I have to think a little bit more.
Ramu, you want to take a shot?
I can weigh in a little bit based on some of my own experience and kind of thinking about this. And I'll start by saying that I'm very much a product of elite institutions. I was an undergraduate at Princeton. As I mentioned, I did my doctoral work at Berkeley. So I've kind of been in this milieu for a long time, both in some ways reaffirming those values that I feel very uncomfortable with in that kind of elite setting, and trying to be critical of them at the same time. And I think that's the difficult position many of us sometimes are in when we're in institutions like UCSF too. So as I've thought about this question of affirmative action and Supreme Court decision last year, It also occurs to me, because I was involved in admissions tangentially when I was at Berkeley. I was at Berkeley for 16 years in various leadership roles. And it occurs to me that we often kind of frame this big question of affirmative action and access, but we sometimes lose sight of the fact that in many cases, affirmative action really affects this tiny sliver of elite undergraduates. I mean, that's often how it's framed, right? And certainly the Supreme Court case addressed that question. There are over 20 million matriculated undergraduate students in the United States at this moment. It's less than 2% of them who are in the, let's say, top 35, 50 undergraduate institutions, at least as ranked by US News or some slightly suspect ranking system. But if we think about that question, and obviously the people in these elite institutions go on to have enormous political and cultural clout. So that matters, that representation matters. People being at those institutions matter. The diversity of that student population is incredibly important. But I've often looked at from the other way, when specifically as I think about undergraduate education and kind of the broader impact, especially in a state like California, where what about the other 19.5 million students? Where are the gates for them? How do we empower them? What kind of pedagogy do we create for people so that they can thrive in a variety of different ways too, right? So there's the affirmative action question. This is why I wanted to reframe it. Then there's a larger question of access more broadly through other public institutions, regional institutions, community college. Again, incredibly powerful vehicles for advancing equity too. So I think we need to focus some advocacy there as well.
Thank you very much for that.
Thank you, Ramu. So pause. That is showing leadership right there. When you have to say, I don't know an answer to that, but my colleague might. But that helped me think a little bit more, so if I may. I think both the affirmative action and meritocracy and equity, the reframing in my head in that conversation is that we have to first address and understand that we didn't start at the same place. We don't have the same starting point. Not all of us do, right? And so once we get that understanding down, so I'll reframe this even more about a workplace setting, is that it may be frustrating that you had a stellar performance evaluation and check all the boxes and have all the degrees and all of the experiences, but you were passed over. And you're asking yourself, why is that? What happened there? And that's where I think the conversation of meritocracy and also equity, what's missing is that we're not starting at the same point, and we don't have the same resources like our other colleagues do. We don't have generational, what's this word? Generational wealth, yes, wealth, and what I really want to say is the good old boys club. What is that? What is a more professional way of saying that? Yes. Yes, we don't have the privilege of just a bigger network. So it's not about you being passed over. So here's the tip, then start building your network. This is where you start, is you attend APASA events, you attend UFA events, you build your network, you build your circle, you bring an Elise and a Clarice and an Eva and Alejandra and team members, and then you surround yourself with folks that are going to uplift you and push you and say your name behind closed door, because that's what they're doing. So we're learning. That's what we're going to do for ourselves. So that is my contribution to that conversation, because it can't just be black and white. It's not just about merit. It's not just about equity. It's first starting that we're not coming from the same point and same place, and now creating the network, and which is our strength. Community and communal mindset is our strength. Now capitalize it.
Thank you for that. Joanna, this next question is coming to you. And again, if you're sensing a little bit of a narrative theme here, we're going towards a certain point, right? So the question for you is this. We just heard Maria talk about sort of building one's own sort of network in order to create some of the structures to achieve more equity. But what are our responsibilities to issues beyond the category of Asian American? In the greater sort of conversation and dialogue about underrepresentation, Asian Americans are just one, albeit very messy, very heterogeneous category. So how do you see the role of Asian Americans in movements like Black Lives Matter, indigenous land rights, or even immigration reform? How do we ensure that Asian American voices are not just focused on, quote, our issues, but are part of larger movements for collective justice?
I feel like you gave me the hardest one there. Yeah, I mean, that's a tough question. And I also think about like our upcoming election as well, right? So I kind of want to, I think that kind of fits into that as well in terms of how, you know, we look at Asian Americans and there's more than just Asian Americans in a group. There's African American, there's Latinx American, and so we have to look beyond just the group that we're in. So take, for example, like our votes. So a lot of people will say that Asian Americans have one voice in their vote, or they all support the same person politically. But that's not necessarily the case, and it's a little bit more nuanced than that. I think we have to think about socioeconomic backgrounds. I think we have to look at where people live in this country, which dictates how people view things. And so if we're trying to create change in a homogeneous group, we're really limiting ourselves from being able to create the impact that we want to see. And by reaching out to more groups and collectively working together as a whole, we're able to accomplish much more, and we're able to be successful in what we want to accomplish in our communities. But if we limit ourselves, then we're not really getting the outreach that we're really hoping for. And so I think it's really important for us to continue to look beyond just our own group and see where there are ways that we can partner with other groups in terms of creating the type of culture in the society, in the community that we want to be able to see where we live and where we work.
Wonderful answer, thank you. There are well-known stereotypes, I think, that Asian Americans contend with, and sometimes on a quite regular basis. The model minority stereotype. And maybe over the last several years, we've actually seen another stereotype, which is the perpetual foreigner. And that especially became pronounced during the height of the COVID pandemic, when there was a little bit of a panic among some aspects of our society, and Asian Americans, as a broad, messy category, experienced a very significant uptick in xenophobia. Asian Americans weren't the only, but they were among. So when you consider that we have these stereotypes that follow members of the so-called Asian American community for individuals who may have been here 3-4 generations, what are some of the things that you think about or would recommend to somebody in terms of how do you address that stereotyping of the perfect model minority or the perpetual foreigner? I mean, just sitting up here, we've heard stories about how we bust some of those stereotypes. My parents forced me to take 8 years of piano, completely lost. Couldn't hold a note. So, how do you think about that, Ramu?
Sorry, asking me. Yeah, so we are pinned down sometimes by those stereotypes, right? And sometimes we embrace them too, unwittingly in some ways.
Say more about the embracing part.
Because sometimes it serves a useful purpose. I'm thinking of my own experience, as I mentioned, at these elite institutions where people make certain assumptions about you, as we were saying, right? There's just stereotypes that underlie who you are. And so at the same time that I was contending with, really overt racism, which we couldn't really fully call racism in the 80s and 90s, I think about the various ways I was othered or treated differently, for so many reasons. But at the same time, the fact that I was in this other category made me interesting or unique. It gave me certain credibility in some spaces too, in those institutions that I occupied. So I think it, despite my sort of lack of self-awareness at that age, it served a certain purpose too. And I think about this question also from another angle. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. That in my own reflection about this and the kind of idea of the perpetual foreigner, for me, one of the operative words there is perpetual. This is not a new story. This is not a new history. It goes back a very long time, especially in California. So those stories are sometimes lost, right? So starting from the sort of mid-19th century through the middle of the 20th century, so many kind of instances of oppression and exclusion, overtly racist laws on the books to keep people out and to create certain gates. And then in 1965, the U.S. had a startlingly liberal kind of immigration policy for some period of time that kind of opened some of the gates. But I think it also opened the gates in terms of, kind of a new sense of sort of new questioning of who's American, right? And I think that reopened those painful questions about foreignness, because suddenly the United States was filled with people who didn't look like the ones who had been there before.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's build on that in a slightly different direction. There's a phrase called the bamboo ceiling. Is everyone familiar with that? It's the equivalent of the glass ceiling for women and their ability to either attain the kind of professional heights that they deserve, et cetera. There are certain limitations, structural limitations that members of the broad Asian American community sometimes feel that they hit, like a bamboo ceiling. They just can't get beyond that. Recognizing that is a thing, and that's a hard thing to kind of unpack in a panel discussion. I'm going to put that as context and maybe ask Maria to comment on some of the more subtle challenges that Asian Americans face in the workplace. Not the sort of, like I just can't seem to break above a certain grade level, whatever, but what are some of the other subtle challenges or factors you think? Let's talk about cultural expectations. Do you think that there are cultural expectations of Asian Americans, broadly speaking, around notions such as deference, communication styles, accents, and even names?
I'm going to give you a homework, because I don't want to sit here and talk to you like a teacher, but instead I want to be a learner with you. I am currently reading for this month a book called Brown Skin, White Minds by E.J. David. And his focus is on his research on colonial mentality. And his focus and audience is Filipino Americans, but I think it's a great read for all of us. And in terms of stereotypes and what might be our expectations, this colonial mentality has a purpose. It keeps us small, it keeps us quiet, it keeps us to say yes and be happy of what we got. And so how do we break free of that? How do I not just be okay with, a story of negotiation salary? And I shared it with my mom, and my mom said, just say yes. They might take it away from you. Why are you even arguing? I was like, because I'm worth more. Okay, thank you. But I really I'm worth more, exclamation, question mark, really was what I was saying out loud. How much more am I worth, right? And so this colonial mentality has a purpose to keep us small and to keep us feeling inferior. So how does that show up in the workplace? Now, if what I'm saying is resonating with you, be curious about it. Why am I feeling inferior? Why is what Maria is saying resonating? If it's not resonating with you, be more curious about it. Why is that not my experience too? Why am I not feeling that way, right? And so I think how we show up in workplace settings, in rooms, in Zoom rooms, and in meetings, I think we need to really consider and be self-reflective of like what's informing how I'm showing up, what's informing how folks are treating me. Am I perpetuating what I might think people might expect from me? My closest colleagues, and now you all in this room, are going to learn I talk a lot, and I might be the loudest in this space. And that might not be the expectation of some colleagues of me. Or that might not be the expectations of leaders of me, right? And so how do I use my capital, which is community building and relationship building, to get in the spaces in the circle that I'm not actually meant to be in? And then be my authentic self and utilize those that have positionality and say, this is what I want to bring forward. And so that took time, that took exercise, that took working out. My rebound after making a mistake was like a day. I just like, oh my God, I don't know what else to do, but I gotta get up and feed my family and do the day all over again. My rebound now is shorter. And what I mean by rebound is make lots of mistakes. Make lots of things that scare you. Do lots of things that scare you because we weren't taught to push, but push anyway. We weren't taught to talk back to our elders, but do it anyway with kindness. Especially if it's your ate or your kuya. I know, but then right? But do it anyway and push and exercise that muscle. It's so uncomfortable, but do it anyway. And your rebound from coming back from that uncomfortableness will get shorter and shorter and shorter, I promise you.
Thank you, Maria. Tiffany, I know we want to make time for some questions from the room. Could I ask Peter one final question? I'll ask you to keep this short, Peter. This is sort of a looking forward, okay? This is easy. This is an easy one.
The answer is yes.
Peter, what do you see as one of the next frontiers of Asian American advocacy? Are there specific policies, cultural shifts, or movements that are important to you? And when you think about that in the context of the future, what do you think is going to be sort of the next area?
Yeah, so I think one of the keys to that next frontier of Asian American advocacy is coming back to something that Maria said, first of all, which is disaggregation. I would say that during COVID, I'll just give you an example. During COVID, all Asian Americans looked average in terms of COVID outcomes. But once we helped force the state, and the CDC wasn't even disaggregating data in the beginning, we found that Filipino nurses actually had one of the highest mortality rates. So if you didn't disaggregate data, you wouldn't know that. So that's an example that might help continue to inform where we should focus our efforts on. But I think one big challenge with being an Asian American is how do you keep your cultural identity moving forward as you assimilate? Because there are pros and cons to both assimilation as well as the richness and the superpowers of what we all have, which again comes back to what was said, which is community and having that network of relationships and those traditions. So I think personally, those are some of the challenges. And I think being curious, I like that word, having dialogue with others and approaching things with openness are some of my own personal goals.
A great way to end this part of the panel conversation. So before we open it up to questions from the room, please give a round of applause to our panelists. And I think we're now going to take some questions from the room, if there are any.
Thank you. What a beautiful panel. You've talked about a number of structural challenges, factors that impacted maybe your lives, your families, your coming to America and all that. What has been the one that you've had to push the most against to make it successfully to where you are right now?
I I think for me, it's, we kind of talked about this earlier, like growing up in my home, my father was a police officer in San Francisco. He worked the graveyard shift, and so my mom was really kind of the parent in the house. So the Korean culture was very strong for me. And so it was very much the, work hard, keep your head down, don't talk back, kind of like what Maria was saying before, don't challenge authority. If you work hard, then good things will come to you. And then, in my career, it was sort of like I found that I was really worried to speak up. I didn't want to challenge authority. I felt like, if I'm doing a good job, then I'll be recognized by my manager or supervisor and I'll have growth opportunities, or I'll get that reclassed or that equity increase. And some managers were supportive in that way, others weren't. And so it was sort of like, well, how do I find my voice to have this conversation with my manager or leader to not look like I'm being disrespectful, which is the word that, was always said in our home, don't be disrespectful, but also advocating for myself. And I think Maria hit it on the head too, in terms of like learning to network and finding your community where you have people that will support you and advocate for you. And it's something that's been really important for me in raising my daughter, of trying to make sure that the things that were ingrained in me as a child that I think were a bit of a hindrance for me are things that she will not experience. And I've taught her, hopefully successfully, she's in college now, to advocate for herself, to speak up for herself. Don't expect others to do that for you because you'll be disappointed. And so finding that voice, knowing your worth, as Maria was saying, and your value, and that you have the right to be at the table. And so I'm looking out here today of many people who have really supported my career and really encouraged me. And so I'm really grateful. And so I feel it's a responsibility as a leader to do the same for others on my team, and and serving as mentors, and also with the future generation.
I'll just add to that a little bit, because this question about kind of what's maybe holding back, what's been the larger challenge. So clearly within the Asian American community, there's this powerful drive towards working hard, advancing, climbing the ladder. So things we've talked about a little bit here. Again, trying to avoid the stereotype, but there's that current. But there's also this countervailing current, at least in my own experience, in my own community, of the importance of family and the things outside of work, and really sort of leaning into that too. So, I can think of countless times my own parents place that, the highest value on that. So you would never sacrifice your family or your time or their well-being for your career, and for the advancement, and for, kind of your immersion in that professional world. So, so that's a tension that I've had to navigate over the years.
The scarcity mindset versus abundant mindset. That has been my biggest tension, in which I constantly have to remind myself that my parents chose to come here to have a better life. Now I question, I had a good life with my grandparents in the Philippines. What do you mean by that? And I question that even till now. What do you mean to better life? Because that was good. I was 8 when I moved. That was a good life. So now with 2 kids, who my 6-year-old asked, can I play the piano? So I didn't force her on it. But giving her the abundance, giving my 2 girls the abundancy of all the activities they want to be in, and not still giving that abundancy, but not using the scarcity mindset to teach them gratitude. I think that's my tension. I am still working at it till this day. My upbringing as an immigrant of scarcity and not having it all of growing up if I ask something of my parents. And that's a different life that my kids are living. And that's a constant tension and conversation I have with parent colleagues.
Do you want to give?
I'll just quickly say that one of my challenges was, like I mentioned, was finding my people who are my people, and